The office lights were dimmed, replaced by soft, moody purple hues that bathed the grand banquet hall. The annual corporate gala had always been a lavish affair, but this year's theme, Masquerade Elegance, added an air of mystery and indulgence to the event. High-ranking executives, polished interns, and seasoned employees mingled, their identities half hidden behind intricate masks. Secrets felt safer behind the veils of satin and lace. Claire adjusted her silver Venetian mask in the bathroom mirror, her heart thudding in a rhythm she couldn't quite calm. Her husband, Evan, was at home with the kids, blissfully unaware of how the night was about to unfold. She'd told him it was just another work event, a boring formality filled with polite handshakes and mindless small talk. He hadn't asked questions, he never did. But tonight was anything but boring. Claire had been restless for months, her perfect life tightening around her like a noose. Her job, her family, her meticulously crafted suburban existence. They felt suffocating. And then came Jason, the ambitious VP with his wolfish smile and piercing eyes. He had a way of leaning in just a little too close, his voice smooth as silk, offering her glimpses of a different life, one teetering on the edge of recklessness. And then there was Daniel, the new hire in marketing. A decade younger than Claire, he had the kind of easy charm and raw energy that reminded her of who she used to be before life became an endless string of obligations. The thought of him alone sent a ripple of anticipation down her spine. Two men, two dangerous games. The plan was simple. Flirt, have a little fun, dance on the edge of impropriety without ever falling in. She told herself it was harmless, a taste of the wildness she'd buried long ago, just enough to feel alive. But she wasn't prepared for how fast things would escalate. Claire stepped out of the bathroom and into the sea of masked faces. The chandeliers sparkled like falling stars, and the music pulsed through the air, a blend of jazz and deep house that felt almost hypnotic. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and Claire grabbed one, taking a long sip. The bubbles fizzed on her tongue, dulling the sharp edge of her nerves. Jason found her first. "Claire," he said, his voice like velvet, eyes burning beneath his black and gold mask. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "You look stunning tonight. Dangerous, even." She smiled, slow and deliberate. "Dangerous? That's quite a compliment." "I mean every word," Jason said, his hand brushing hers just long enough to send a jolt of electricity up her arm. A thrill coursed through her, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The heat between their bodies, the unspoken promise in his gaze. But then she saw him. Daniel stood across the room, leaning casually against the bar, watching her with that crooked grin of his. His dark blue mask couldn't hide the glint in his eyes, the kind of look that said he knew exactly what she was doing and was more than ready to play along. Two men, two paths, one night. The game had officially begun. More champagne, more whispered conversations. Jason's hand on the small of her back as he guided her toward the balcony, where the cool night air felt like salvation. "Your trouble?" Jason murmured, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her wrist. "Am I?" she said, her breath hitching as his lips hovered dangerously close to hers. Before she could decide whether to give in or pull away, her phone buzzed in her purse. A text. Claire ignored it, but Jason's eyes flicked toward her bag. "Expecting someone?" "Not tonight," she said, her voice steady, even though her pulse betrayed her. Jason didn't push. He never did. He just smiled, confident as ever, and pulled her closer. The world tilted as his lips brushed against hers. Not quite a kiss, but enough to send her thoughts spiraling. But before she could lose herself completely, a voice cut through the night. "Am I interrupting?" Claire spun around to find Daniel standing at the balcony entrance, his smile playful, but his eyes gleaming with something darker. Jason stepped back, his expression unreadable. Claire's heart raced. The air crackled with tension, thick enough to drown in. "No," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "We were just catching up." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Lucky me. Mind if I steal you for a dance?" Jason looked at her, waiting, Claire felt like a rope being pulled from both ends, stretched thinner by the second. "Of course," she said, slipping out of Jason's grasp and into Daniel's waiting hand. The music swelled, the bass line thrumming in her chest. Daniel's hand was warm and steady as it rested on her waist, his grip possessive in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. "You like playing with fire, don't you?" he whispered. Claire smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Fire was one thing, infernos were another entirely, and tonight she was dancing dangerously close to the flames. The dance floor was a living, breathing organism. Shadows and light intertwined in time with the beat, masking sins and secrets. Daniel's hand lingered just a fraction too long on Claire's waist as he led her into the rhythm of the music. His fingers pressed against the bare skin at the small of her back, igniting a spark that was impossible to ignore. Claire wasn't sure if it was the champagne, the music, or the adrenaline, but she felt invincible. For once, her carefully constructed world of routines and responsibilities felt miles away. Right now, all that existed was this moment. The heat of Daniel's breath against her ear, the pulse of the bass beneath her feet, and the way his eyes burned into her. "You're full of surprises," he said, his lips brushing against her ear. "Am I?" Claire's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried enough weight to send a jolt of excitement straight to Daniel's core. "You are. You've got this edge," he said, tightening his grip on her waist. "You hide it well, but it's there. I can see it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a shadow crossed her peripheral vision. Jason. He leaned against a nearby column, watching them with an unreadable expression. His mask glinted under the lights, giving him a predatory look that sent a thrill of fear and excitement down her spine. It wasn't the first time Claire had been caught in a tug-of-war between two men, but this was the first time it felt like it might spiral out of her control. "Let's get some air," Daniel said, his hands sliding down to entwine with hers. She glanced back at Jason, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on hers. For a moment, she thought he might follow them, but then he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Daniel led her through a side door, out into a quiet courtyard bathed in moonlight. The distant hum of the party faded into the background, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the sound of her own rapid breathing. "You know," Daniel said, his voice low and steady, "I wasn't sure you'd take my bait tonight." Claire's heart skipped a beat. "Bait?" Daniel chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, come on. You think I didn't notice the way you've been watching me at the office? The way you linger at my desk just a little too long? I've been waiting for you to make a move." The ground beneath her felt unsteady. This was a game, yes, but she wasn't sure she liked how quickly Daniel had turned the tables. "And what makes you think I'm interested?" Claire asked, tilting her head, her voice laced with defiance. Daniel stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "Because you're here, alone, with me." His lips hovered just above hers, daring her to close the gap. And that's when her phone buzzed again. Claire froze. This time she couldn't ignore it. She pulled out her phone, her eyes widening at the name on the screen. It was a text from Jason. "You should be careful who you trust." Her blood ran cold. She looked up at Daniel, who was watching her with a wolfish grin, completely unfazed. "Something wrong?" he asked. Claire tried to steady her breathing. "No, it's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Jason was warning her. The question was, from what? Claire's fingers gripped her phone as she reread Jason's message. "You should be careful who you trust." Her pulse quickened, every nerve in her body screaming at her to walk away from Daniel. But his smile remained fixed, cool, confident, and far too knowing. His eyes searched hers as though he could see the conflict brewing inside her. "What's the message?" Daniel asked, his voice calm, but his eyes flicking to her phone. "Just my husband," Claire lied, tucking the phone back into her clutch. "Checking in." Daniel's expression didn't change, but she caught a flicker of something dark, before his smirk returned. "Well," he said, stepping back into the shadows. I'm sure he trusts you completely. The way he said it sent a chill down her spine. Maybe we should head back inside, Claire suggested, her voice tight. Daniel didn't argue. He simply offered his arm, his eyes still locked on hers. Claire hesitated for a second before taking it, her skin tingling where they touched. Just stay calm. Play it cool. The party had shifted while they were gone. The music was louder, the crowd looser, laughter more uninhibited. The masquerade theme had given way to something else entirely, something raw and chaotic. People clung to each other in dark corners. Masks were slipping, revealing far more than faces. Claire scanned the room for Jason, but he was nowhere in sight. Daniel led her back to the bar and ordered 2 drinks. Relax, he said, handing her a glass of bourbon. You're too tense. What's the worst that could happen? Claire raised an eyebrow. You don't want to know. Cheers, Daniel said, clinking his glass against hers. The liquid burned as it slid down her throat, but it did nothing to dull the growing unease in her chest. She needed to get out of here, needed air, needed Jason. And then, as if conjured by her thoughts, she spotted him. He was standing near the edge of the room, his mask tilted slightly to the side, revealing sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to cut straight through her. Jason didn't move toward her. He simply nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before disappearing into the hallway. Claire hesitated for a split second before turning to Daniel. I need to use the restroom, she said quickly. He looked at her with mild suspicion but didn't stop her. I'll be here, he said, his voice dripping with something that felt dangerously close to a promise. The hallway was quieter, lit by flickering sconces that cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. Jason waited at the far end, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. You got my message, he said as she approached. What the hell was that supposed to mean? Claire demanded, her voice low but urgent. Jason's eyes darted past her, checking to see if anyone had followed. Then he leaned in close. Daniel's not who you think he is, he whispered. He's dangerous. This isn't a game to him. It never was. Claire laughed, but it came out brittle and hollow. And you are? Give me a break, Jason. You're the one who's been circling me like a vulture for months. Jason grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. Listen to me. He's done this before, with women at work. It always starts like this, innocent flirting, a little fun. But then he gets possessive, obsessive, and it never ends well for the women involved. Claire pulled her hand free. You're being ridiculous. Jason sighed, his expression softening. Just be careful. Don't let him pull you into his world. You won't like what you find there. Before Claire could respond, the hallway light flickered, casting them in darkness for a brief second. When the light steadied again, Jason was gone, vanished into the shadows like a ghost. Claire stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, the weight of his words sinking in. Daniel's not who you think he is. She didn't want to believe it, but a part of her, the part that had seen the gleam in Daniel's eyes, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, knew Jason was telling the truth. But it was too late to turn back now. Claire's heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she made her way back to the main hall, Jason's warning replaying in her mind like a broken record. Daniel's not who you think he is. The party roared on around her, but it felt distant, like she was moving through a dream or a nightmare. Her eyes scanned the crowd for Daniel. She needed to act normal, keep the mask in place until she figured out what the hell was going on. Then, she spotted him at the bar, his back to her. He was talking to someone. A tall man with dark hair and a serious expression. The man leaned in, whispering something into Daniel's ear. Daniel nodded, his face darkening. Claire froze. The man glanced in her direction for a split second before walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Daniel turned toward her, his smile slow and deliberate as he raised his glass in a silent toast. He knows. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she forced herself to walk toward him, her heart hammering in her chest. There you are, Daniel said, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. I was starting to think you'd left me. Of course not, Claire said, smiling as if everything were perfectly normal. I just needed a breather. Daniel gestured toward the empty stool next to him. Sit. Stay a while. Claire hesitated. Get out. Now. But before she could respond, Daniel leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. I saw you talking to Jason. Claire's blood turned to ice. What did he say to you? Daniel asked, his eyes boring into hers. Claire forced a laugh. Jason? Oh, he was just checking on me. Being protective. Daniel smirked. Of course he was. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Then Daniel leaned back, taking a sip of his drink. You know, I've always admired your curiosity, he said, his voice smooth as silk. It's one of the things that makes you so interesting. Claire swallowed hard. She needed to get out of here, needed time to think, to process everything Jason had said. I should probably get going, she said, slipping off the stool. It's getting late. Daniel's hand shot out, gently but firmly wrapping around her wrist. Leaving already? He asked, his voice soft, almost tender. But the night's just getting started. Claire smiled, trying to keep her breathing steady. I'll see you at work. Daniel's grip tightened for a split second before he let go. Of course, he said, his smile never wavering. See you Monday. Claire turned and walked away, every step feeling like it might be her last. The cool night air hit her like a slap as she stepped outside. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed a message to Jason. We need to talk. But before she could hit send, a car door slammed nearby. Claire's head snapped up. A black sedan idled at the curb, its windows tinted. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing the man who had been whispering to Daniel earlier. He smiled at her, cold and calculating. Need a ride? Claire took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her body felt frozen. The man in the car watched her with unsettling calm, his smile thin and deliberate. Don't be shy, he said, his voice smooth but hollow, like a practiced salesman offering something she couldn't afford to refuse. It's not safe to be alone out here. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Get out of here. Now, I'm fine, Claire said, forcing a smile she didn't feel. Just waiting for my ride. The man tilted his head, his eyes scanning her face as if memorizing every detail. Suit yourself, he said, his tone tinged with something dark and final. He rolled up the window, and the black sedan eased away from the curb, its taillights fading into the night. Claire stood there for a moment, her breath coming in short gasps. What the hell was that? Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced down at the screen. It was Jason. Meet me at the cafe across the street. Now, the cafe was mostly empty, save for a tired-looking barista wiping down tables and a couple in the corner, lost in their own world. Jason was seated at a table near the back, his mask gone, his face tense. Claire slid into the seat across from him, her hands still shaking. Who was that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jason leaned in, his eyes serious. One of Daniel's associates. Claire frowned. Associates? What does that even mean? Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. Daniel's not just some charming coworker, Claire. He's involved in things, dark things. That man in the car? He's not just a random guy. He's part of it. Part of what? Claire's voice rose slightly, but Jason held up a hand to calm her. Let's just say Daniel has a history of getting too close to women at work. When they try to break things off, they disappear. Claire stared at him, her mind reeling. Disappear? Jason nodded grimly. Or they're forced out of the company, their reputations destroyed. Some of them just vanish. No explanations, no goodbyes. That's ridiculous, Claire said, her voice shaking. This isn't some crime drama. This is real life. Jason leaned closer, his eyes boring into hers. It's more real than you think. I've seen it happen. I've tried to stop it before, but Daniel's always one step ahead. And now, he's got his sights set on you. Claire's stomach twisted into knots. She thought of Daniel's intense gaze, the way his hand lingered on her wrist just a little too long, the way he always seemed to know where she was, what she was doing. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jason hesitated. "You need to leave. Tonight. Get out of town, at least for a while. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Not even me. Just disappear before he can pull you in deeper." Claire's head spun. This was insane. She couldn't just leave her life behind. But the alternative, the image of those women who had vanished without a trace, sent a chill down her spine. "I'll help you," Jason said, his voice softening. "But we have to move fast. If Daniel finds out you're planning to leave, he'll make sure you can't." Claire swallowed hard, her mind racing. Could she trust Jason? Did she have any other choice? "All right," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Help me." Jason nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Meet me at the train station in an hour. Pack light. We'll figure out the rest once we're out of the city." Claire stood, her heart pounding. "An hour." Jason grabbed her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're doing the right thing." She nodded, but as she turned to leave, a thought gnawed at the back of her mind. What if Jason wasn't the one she needed to be afraid of? The apartment felt eerie in the dark. Claire moved quickly, grabbing a small overnight bag and stuffing it with essentials, just enough to vanish without leaving a trail. Her pulse raced as she zipped it up, Jason's warning echoing in her head. "You need to leave. Tonight." But doubt gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the way Jason had looked at her. Almost too desperate, too intense. Was he really trying to help her? Or was she just trading one trap for another? Claire's phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up and froze. It wasn't Jason. It was Daniel. "We need to talk. I'm outside." Her blood ran cold. Slowly, she stepped toward the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. A sleek black car idled across the street. Daniel was leaning against it, staring up at her apartment. Her breath caught in her throat. How did he know? Claire backed away from the window, her heart hammering. She grabbed her bag and headed for the back door. If she could make it to the alley, she'd have a chance to slip away unnoticed. The stairs creaked under her feet as she descended, each sound amplifying her panic. She pushed open the door to the alley and froze. Another man stood at the alley's entrance. The same man who had been whispering to Daniel at the party. His eyes locked onto hers, and his mouth curled into a slow, menacing smile. "Going somewhere?" Claire didn't answer. She turned and bolted in the other direction, her footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. Her lungs burned as she sprinted toward the street, her only thought to get as far away as possible. She burst onto the main road, nearly colliding with a passing cyclist. The man from the alley was nowhere to be seen, but she knew he was close. "Think, Claire, think." Her phone buzzed again. "Jason, where are you? You're late." She hesitated, her eyes darting up and down the street. Could she trust him? A cab cruised by, and Claire waved it down. "Train station," she said, sliding into the back seat and locking the door. The station was nearly empty, its fluorescent lights casting a pale, sickly glow on the tiled floor. Claire clutched her bag tightly, scanning the platform for Jason. He appeared moments later, his expression a mix of relief and urgency. "What happened?" he asked, pulling her aside. "Daniel," Claire said, breathless. "He was outside my apartment. He knows." Jason's jaw tightened. "Then we're out of time." He grabbed her hand, leading her toward the far end of the platform. A train rumbled in the distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness. "We'll get on the next train," Jason said. "Once we're out of the city, we'll figure out our next move." But before they could take another step, a voice rang out behind them. "Claire!" She spun around. Daniel stood at the entrance to the platform, his eyes locked on hers. "Don't do this," he said, his voice calm, but there was a razor's edge beneath it. Jason stepped in front of her, shielding her from Daniel's gaze. "Stay back," he warned. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Jason, 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 still trying to play the hero, I see. Jason didn't move. His body tensed like a coiled spring, ready to strike. Claire, Daniel said, his eyes softening as they met hers. You don't know what he's told you, but I promise you he's lying. He's been lying from the beginning. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She looked at Jason, then back at Daniel, her head spinning. Don't listen to him, Jason said quickly. He's trying to confuse you. Daniel took a step closer. Think, Claire. Why do you think he's so eager to help you? He doesn't want to protect you. He wants to own you. Jason grabbed her arm. Let's go. Now. But Claire hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. Who was telling the truth? Claire's breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting between Jason and Daniel. Every instinct screamed at her to choose. But who? Jason's grip tightened on her arm. His voice was low, urgent. Claire, we don't have time for this. If you want to live, we need to leave now. Daniel took another step closer, his eyes sharp, calculating. He's lying to you, Claire. Ask him about Samantha. Ask him what happened to her. Jason's face darkened. His jaw clenched, but he didn't let go of her arm. Don't listen to him, he said, his voice colder now. He's trying to mess with your head. Samantha. The name echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. Claire had heard it once before. An ex-employee who had left the company under strange circumstances. People whispered about it, but no one knew the full story. Jason, Claire said slowly, her pulse racing. Who is Samantha? Jason didn't answer right away. His grip loosened, and for the first time that night, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Don't, Daniel warned, his voice steady. Don't lie to her again. Jason shot Daniel a withering glare before turning back to Claire. She was someone I tried to help, he said finally. Like you. But she made a mistake. She trusted Daniel. And she paid the price. Claire shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. What happened to her? Jason hesitated. His eyes darted toward the train approaching in the distance, its headlights casting long shadows across the platform. She's gone, he said quietly. That's all you need to know. Daniel chuckled darkly. Gone? That's one way to put it. Or maybe she found out the truth about you and didn't live to tell anyone else. Claire's stomach dropped. What the hell is he talking about? Jason turned to her, his expression hardening. We need to leave. Now, you've already seen what Daniel's capable of. You don't want to end up like Samantha. But Claire's feet refused to move. A deep, gnawing doubt rooted her in place. What if I'm already making the same mistake she did? Daniel held out his hand, his eyes steady and unwavering. Come with me. I can protect you. I can show you what's really going on. You just have to trust me. Jason stepped in front of her again, his body blocking her view of Daniel.
No, Claire.
If you want to stay alive, you'll walk onto that train with me. Right now. The train screeched to a halt, the doors hissing open. The platform buzzed with the sound of people stepping on and off, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. Claire stared at the train, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seconds to decide. Her breath came fast and shallow as the weight of her choice crushed her. Jason or Daniel? Then she made her decision. Without a word, Claire turned and ran toward the train. But she didn't take Jason's hand. Daniel's footsteps echoed behind her as he chased her onto the train, his hand catching hers just as the doors slid shut. Jason stood frozen on the platform, his face contorted in shock and fury as the train pulled away. You made the right choice, Daniel said, his grip firm but not unkind. Claire wasn't sure if that was true. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. But one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. The train rattled forward, the city blurring into streaks of light outside the windows. Claire sat stiffly in her seat, Daniel next to her, his hand resting lightly on her wrist. His grip wasn't tight, but it made her acutely aware that leaving wasn't an option. Not anymore. The carriage was nearly empty, save for an older man sleeping at the far end and a woman typing furiously on her phone. The hum of the train filled the silence between them, but tension crackled in the air. "You're safe now," Daniel said, his voice calm, reassuring. Claire didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked toward the door at the far end of the train, as though calculating how fast she could run if she had to. "What have I done?" Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I know you're scared, but I need you to trust me. Jason's been lying to you from the start." Claire's throat tightened. "And why should I believe you?" Daniel sighed, his eyes softening. "Because I have nothing to gain by lying. Jason, on the other hand, he plays the savior, but he's far from innocent." Claire crossed her arms, leaning back against the seat. "Then tell me about Samantha, the real story." Daniel hesitated for a split second, just long enough for doubt to creep in. "She worked with us," he said slowly. "Brilliant, talented. But Jason became obsessed with her. He manipulated her, convinced her she needed his help. By the time she realized what he was really after, it was too late." Claire's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, too late?" Daniel's eyes darkened. "Jason's not the kind of man who takes rejection well. Samantha tried to get away from him and she vanished. No one knows where she is, but I have my suspicions." A chill ran down Claire's spine. "You're saying Jason did something to her?" "I'm saying he's dangerous," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "And you were about to walk right into his trap." Claire wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was, a part of her had always sensed something off about Jason. His intensity, the way he seemed too eager to help, too ready to control the narrative. She glanced down at her phone, her thumb hovering over Jason's last message. "Where are you? You're late." A message that felt far more like a command than a question. Daniel watched her carefully. "I know it's a lot to process, but you need to stay with me until we're sure you're safe." Claire looked up at him, her stomach twisting into knots. She didn't know what to believe anymore. But the one thing she knew for sure was that she wasn't going to let herself be a pawn in someone else's game. "I need answers," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Real answers. No more half-truths." Daniel nodded. "You'll get them. I promise." The train slowed as it pulled into a station, the doors hissing open. Daniel stood, extending his hand to her. "Come with me," he said. "It's time you saw the whole picture." Claire hesitated for a split second before taking his hand. The station was quiet, almost too quiet. Dim yellow lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the cracked concrete floor. The smell of damp metal hung heavy in the air. Daniel led her down a narrow corridor, his footsteps echoing softly. Claire's heart thudded in her chest with every step. "Where are we going?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "To someone who can help you understand what's really going on," Daniel said without looking back. They stopped in front of an unmarked door. Daniel knocked twice, then paused before knocking again. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and short, dark hair. She looked Claire up and down, her expression unreadable. "You brought her," the woman said, her voice flat. Daniel nodded. "She needs to know the truth." The woman stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Claire hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn and run, but curiosity, and a deep need for answers, pulled her forward. The room was sparse, lit by a single overhead bulb that buzzed faintly. Papers and photos were spread across a table in the center, most of them showing faces Claire didn't recognize, except for one. Jason. His photo was pinned to the center of a web of lines and notes, circled in red. Claire's stomach churned. "What is this?" The woman crossed her arms. "Evidence. Jason's been running a scheme for years, targeting women like you, vulnerable, ambitious, easy to manipulate. He gains their trust, makes them dependent on him, and when they try to break free..." She trailed off, her eyes darkening. "They disappear," Daniel finished. Claire stared at the web of photos, her pulse roaring in her ears. "But why would he do that?" The woman leaned against the table, her gaze steady. "Control. Power. Some men get off on playing God with people's lives." Claire's head spun. She thought back to all the times Jason had inserted himself into her life, always ready with a solution, always just a little too involved. Had he been grooming her all along? Daniel touched her shoulder, his voice soft. You're not alone, Claire. We'll help you, but you need to stay hidden until we're sure you're safe. Claire nodded slowly, her eyes still locked on Jason's photo. She didn't know how deep the rabbit hole went, but one thing was clear. She was in far more danger than she'd ever imagined. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with tension and unspoken truths. Claire's eyes never left Jason's photo pinned at the center of the evidence board. Everything she thought she knew was unraveling before her, piece by piece. I trusted him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He made me believe he was protecting me. Daniel stepped closer, his voice calm and steady. That's what he does. He builds trust, creates dependency, and then takes everything away when you least expect it. Claire clenched her fists, anger rising in her chest like a tidal wave. She had been played, carefully, methodically played, and now the only question that remained was what she was going to do about it. The woman, who had introduced herself as Marianne, crossed her arms and leaned against the table. We can't let him keep doing this, she said. You have two choices. Disappear and hope he never finds you, or confront him head-on and expose him for what he is. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Expose him? How? He's smart. He'll twist everything to make me look crazy. No one will believe me. That's why you're not doing this alone, Daniel said. We've been collecting evidence for months. Phone records, witness statements, financial documents. All we needed was someone brave enough to come forward and make it public. Me, Claire said, the realization hitting her like a freight train. Marian nodded. You're the missing piece. With your testimony, we can take him down. For a long moment, Claire said nothing. Her mind raced through every possible outcome, every scenario where this could go horribly wrong. Jason wouldn't go down without a fight. He would come for her, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to survive it. But then she thought about Samantha. She thought about the women who had vanished, their lives destroyed, their stories erased. And she thought about how close she had come to becoming one of them. No more. I'll do it, Claire said, her voice trembling but resolute. I'll help you take him down. Daniel and Marianne exchanged a glance. Then we need to move fast, Marianne said. Jason will know something's up when you don't answer his messages. We'll need to lure him into the open on our terms. Claire's stomach tightened. What do you mean? We'll set a trap, Daniel said. One he can't resist. The plan was simple in theory, but execution would be everything. Claire agreed to meet Jason the next day at a cafe they had often frequented together. The goal was to confront him in public, armed with enough evidence to back him into a corner. Marianne would be nearby, ready to record everything, while Daniel waited outside in case things went south. The hours leading up to the meeting passed in a blur. Claire barely slept, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would stay calm, how she would make him pay for everything he had done. But as she walked into the cafe the next afternoon, her heart pounding in her chest, all her carefully laid plans threatened to crumble. Jason was already there, sitting at a table by the window, his face calm, his eyes unreadable. He stood as she approached, smiling like nothing was wrong. Claire, he said warmly, pulling out a chair for her. You're a hard woman to track down these days. Claire forced a smile, her palms slick with sweat. Yeah, it's been a crazy couple of days. Jason leaned back, studying her. I was worried about you. You left the party so abruptly. Claire took a deep breath, steadying herself. There's something we need to talk about. Jason raised an eyebrow. Oh, Claire pulled out her phone, opening the folder Marianne had helped her prepare. I know everything, Jason. About Samantha. About the others. About what you've been doing to women at the company. For the first time, Jason's mask slipped. His eyes hardened, his smile turning razor sharp. You've been talking to Daniel, haven't you? Claire didn't answer. She held up her phone, her hand trembling but steady. I'm not afraid of you anymore. It's over. Jason chuckled, low and dangerous. Oh, Claire, you've always been so naive. You really think you can beat me at my own game? A voice crackled in her earpiece, Marianne's voice. Stay calm. We've got everything recorded. Jason leaned in, his eyes dark and predatory. You won't get away with this. No one will believe you. I'll bury you, just like I did the others. Claire's pulse raced, but she refused to back down. Not this time. The door to the cafe burst open, and Daniel strode in, followed by two plainclothes officers. Jason's eyes flicked toward them, his jaw tightening. Jason Reed, one of the officers said, pulling out a badge. You're under arrest for fraud, coercion, and multiple counts of harassment. Jason turned back to Claire, his eyes blazing. This isn't over, he hissed. Oh, I think it is, Claire said, her voice steady. Good luck explaining yourself in court. The officers dragged Jason out of the cafe, his protests drowned out by the hum of the other patrons. Daniel and Marian joined Claire at the table, relief washing over their faces. You did it, Daniel said, placing a hand on her shoulder. It's over, Claire exhaled, the weight of the past few days crashing down on her all at once. It's over. But deep down, she knew the scars would linger for a long time. Trust wouldn't come easy anymore, and the shadows Jason had cast over her life would take time to fade. Still, she had survived. She had taken back control, and for the first time in a long while, Claire felt free.